one-third of its average level in recent decades.
You'll be able to see all of this hearing later in our program schedule on the C-SPAN networks and, of course, in our video library at cspan.org. We're going to leave this now and take you live to the U.S. Senate.
About this bill, because I think it's really poor public policy. I know that back home in all of our states, people are concerned about the future. I'm concerned about the future. People are concerned about manufacturing jobs. I'm concerned about manufacturing jobs. And it seems to me that, Mr. President, what we ought to focus on is those things that will take us to the place we want to be. I know a lot of times when we're having these types of economic situations, the country turns inward. The country tries to look for other things to blame the cause of where we are on. And I think that's exactly what this bill is doing. Again, Mr. President, here we have a situation where our economy is slow. We have a financial crisis in Europe which is creating tremendous fear in every country in the world. And what we're looking at doing in this United States Senate is creating a trade war with the second largest economy in the world, one that's growing rapidly, one where our exports to this country grew twice as fast in the year 2010 as it did on average to the rest of the world. So, Mr. President, this to me is one of those bills where you cut your nose off to spite your face. It's one of those bills where you try to make it look like that you're doing something constructive back home, when what you're really doing is hurting the U.S. economy. Mr. President, we've got 3 free trade bills that are coming to the floor that have been held up now for over 900 days that I think are going to pass, and this body is going to embrace them because we know that this country is losing market share in the 3 countries that we're reaching an agreement with. We're losing market share in South Korea. We're losing market share in Colombia. We're losing market share in Panama. In other words, the manufacturers in Tennessee and Virginia and all across this country have lesser ability to sell their goods into these 3 countries because these free trade agreements are not in place. And it's my sense that we're getting ready to do something constructive and in a bipartisan way approve these bills. So, Mr. President, what is stunning to me is that we'd be taking up another bill that would actually likely hurt trade with the fastest growing other economy and the biggest other economy in the world. So, Mr. President, look, to me what we ought to be focused on with China, by the way, China does manipulate its currency. It does do that. It has something called a managed float. Their financial system is antiquated. It is being liberalized. They understand that what they're doing with their currency has to change. And by the way, over the last 5 years, the Chinese currency has actually appreciated relative to our dollar by 30%. China knows that it has to do even more of that, and the fact is that as people's standard of living in China improves, they're going to want even greater access to American goods. So, Mr. President, what we ought to be doing, instead of trying to create a trade war with an economy, a country that we want to create better relationships with, is we ought to be focusing on the real problems that exist in China. There is no question that the Chinese government needs to open up procurement policies. As a government, they are a large purchaser of goods. And right now, they have laws in place that cause them to purchase those goods from companies that exist in China. We need to cause them to open up. The Secretary General, or the person that we believe to be the next leader of China, is going to be here in January. And this is something that our President ought to talk with him about when he comes and create an opportunity for success for our companies here in America to be able to sell goods to China. Secondly, we should focus on intellectual property rights. There is no question that Chinese companies take advantage of U.S. companies by stealing intellectual property rights. It exists in almost every area, and that is something that we certainly should be talking to China about. Thirdly, we ought to be talking about China investing in this country. I mean, the fact is that we'd like to see more plants created in this country. We'd like to see more manufacturing occur. And so, yes, We should be talking to China about making investments in this country. And then lastly, certainly, we should be creating avenues for Chinese consumers to have greater access to American goods. Mr. President, that is the type of solution, or those are the types of solutions we ought to be talking about. They can be dealt with, certainly, at the executive branch level. There are WTO violations we ought to be bringing to the WTO's attention. But this bill, in my opinion, is great in optics. It allows senators to go back home. By the way, the Senate is supposed to be the cooler place. It's interesting that the leadership of the House, where you might expect a bill like this to move out quickly, a hot piece of legislation, the leader of the House has already talked about what bad policy this is. So hopefully this bill will not gain traction if it passes the Senate in the House of Representatives. But the fact is, this is not the kind of thing the United States Senate ought to be taking up, and certainly not something the United States Senate ought to be passing. Mr. President, again, here we are. We're in a situation where we have an economic slowdown. The markets continually get worse and have been especially since August the 2nd. We've got a financial crisis in Europe where contagion with those financial institutions is potentially spreading around the world. And here, the United States Senate, in its wisdom, is considering creating a trade war to add to that. This is exactly the kind of reaction and behavior that took place in the 1930s. And again, it's almost as if we cannot learn from the past. Mr. President, I understand that numbers of senators voted to proceed to this bill, and I understand that we ought to have debates on these kind of things. That's what the United States Senate is for. But I would encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that don't have an investment in this bill, and again, I realize there are numbers of co-sponsors, but I would encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up, to realize that this is terrible policy. I know that back home it may sound good, but I think when Americans understand that what we're really doing is pursuing the wrong issues in the name of trying to make ourselves look good back home, hopefully, this bill will not see the light of day. Hopefully this bill we will not have the 60 votes to have cloture on this bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hear this over and over and over in this body and in the House of Representatives that, whenever anybody talks about, whenever the President of the United States talks about increasing taxes on millionaires, just making their tax rate the same as middle-class taxpayers, the other side yells, class warfare, class warfare, class warfare, against the rich, when we know the class warfare in this country has been aimed right at the middle class. That's what's cost so many middle-class jobs, caused so many people in the middle class to see their incomes flat for the last 10 years. And when I hear discussions about trade, I always hear characterizations of protectionism or trade war. And, Mr. President, we're in a trade war. Look at the number of jobs that we've lost to China in the last 10 years. You don't have to look very far to know every time you go to the store and buy something, it seems that darn near everything's made in China. And it wasn't that way 10 years ago. It sure wasn't that way 20 years ago. 10 years ago, when this body made the mistake, and many of us opposed it, and I was in the House of Representatives then, so it's something called permanent normal trade relations with China, letting China join the World Trade Organization. In those days, there was a relatively small trade deficit with China. A trade deficit means we buy more from them than we sell to them. Today, that trade deficit with China is about $750 million every single day. Every day, we buy $750 million worth of products from China more than we sell to China. And if you're buying that much more than you sell day after day after day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, you end up losing jobs because these are the things we were making in this country. Never in our history, Mr. President, do I remember that I can, looking back, I'm not a professional historian, but I've never heard anybody say otherwise on this, that companies in one country will shut their production down. They'll stop producing steel in Steubenville or stop producing other products, chemicals in Cleveland, or stop producing cars in Dayton, or stop producing glass in Toledo. They'll shut down a plant, they'll move it to another country, often China, and then they'll sell the product back into the home country, into the United States of America. Mr. President, that's not a ticket to the middle class for middle-class Americans anymore, for potential middle-class Americans. It's not good economic policy. It doesn't put us in a place that we need to do. So when I hear the opponents to this whole idea of leveling the playing field saying, oh my gosh, the Senate, which is supposed to cool the saucer, whatever that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson term was, cool the hot tea of the saucer, or however he said that, then say this is a trade war. I mean, that our doing this, our saying simply level the playing field is a trade war, is just unilateral disarmament. The Chinese understand what a trade war is about. Let me give you one story real quick, one example. I was talking to a gentleman who works for paper companies in the United States, including paper companies. We have a lot of paper, still have some paper manufacturers in Ohio, and Chillicothe, and West Carrollton, sort of Dayton area, and down into Butler County near Cincinnati, some other places around the state. And he said that the Chinese, which didn't even have a coated paper industry 15 years ago, the kind of paper that's the glossy magazine-type paper, that the Chinese started this industry 15 years ago. They buy their wood pulp in Brazil. They ship it to China. They mill it in China. And paper is expensive to transport. It's heavy for the cost of it, and it's bulky for the cost of it. They take the wood pulp from Brazil, they ship it to China, they mill it in China, they sell it back here. The labor cost of making paper is only 10% of the cost, yet they can undercut prices here. Why is that? Well, we assume they subsidize water and capital and land and energy. We also know they get a 25% additional subsidy because of currency, because the Chinese game the currency system. They devalue their currency. They underappreciate, if you will, their currency, meaning they, in a sense, get a bonus. When they sell anything to the United States, anything, they get a 25% discount. So they can undercut American manufacturers that could be even more efficient than they are. Or if the United States sells into China, they get a 25%. We get our sellers, our producers get a 25% penalty. But look at the job loss, Mr. President. I mean, this is the whole story. This really is the whole story. And when I hear my colleagues say, the 10 co-sponsors, we have 5 Democrats, Senator Schumer and I, Senator Hagan, Senator Stabenow, Senator Casey, 5 Republicans, Senator Snowe and Collins of Maine, Senator Sessions of Alabama, Senator Burr of North Carolina, Senator Graham from South Carolina. This is a bipartisan effort that got 79 votes out of 98 yesterday. But when I hear them say, the other side say, we're starting a trade war, look at this. California in the last 10 years, since PNTR, since we set up this relationship with China and allowed China into the World Trade Organization, look at the job loss. California lost almost 500,000 jobs. Most of these are manufacturing. Texas lost 232,000. My state lost 103,000 jobs. These are 103,000 people, Mr. President, that saw their plant close. We've lost 50,000 manufacturing plants in this country in the last decade or so. These 103,596 people are people, and they lose their job at $16 an hour manufacturing. They often lose their health insurance. They often lose their home. Imagine, it's easy for us to talk numbers and easy for us dressed like this and getting paid well to do these jobs. It's easy for us to forget what an individual suffering from this kind of job loss is all about. And imagine, Mr. President, just imagine a family in Richmond or a family in Columbus where they lost their job, then they lost their health care, then they lost their home. They have to go to their 12-year-old's daughter and say, honey, you know, we're going to have to move. We're losing our house. We can't live here anymore. I mean, these are terrible human problems. And to dismiss our efforts to try to come to an even play, a level playing field so we can compete is what we need to do, not calling names of trade war and protectionism and class warfare and all that. Mr. President, I'll conclude my remarks. There will be much more in the next 2 days debate on these issues. I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Under the previous order, all post-closure time is yielded back. The motion to proceed to S1619 is agreed to, and the clerk will report the bill.
Calendar number 183, S1619, a bill to provide for identification of misaligned currency, require action to correct the misalignment, and for other purposes.
The bill having been reported, Mr. President, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment numbered 694.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment numbered 695 to amendment numbered 694.
I have a motion to commit the bill with instructions. That's also at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to commit the bill as 1619 to the Committee on Finance with instructions to report back with the amendment numbered 696.
Ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have an amendment to the instructions.
The clerk will report the amendment to the instructions.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment numbered 697 to the instructions of amendment numbered 696 to the motion to commit.
Ask for the yeas and nays on that.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the second-degree amendment.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment numbered 698 to amendment numbered 697.
Just the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Majority Leader.
Pass the announcement. All quorum be terminated.
With objections, ordered.
Mr. President.
Republican Leader.
Mr. President, for 3 weeks, President Obama has been traveling across the country calling on Congress to pass what he calls his jobs bill right away. Here's what he'll say in Texas today, if he's not said it already. At least put this jobs bill up for a vote so the entire country knows exactly where every member of Congress stands. Well, Mr. President, I agree with the President. I think he's entitled to a vote on his jobs bill. The suggestion that Senate Republicans are not interested in voting on his jobs bill is not true. I think he's entitled to a vote. It won't surprise anyone to know I don't think it's a good approach, a way that's likely to create jobs, but he's asked for a vote. And I think we ought to accommodate the President of the United States on a matter that he has been speaking about frequently over the last few weeks and give him his vote. In fact, they've been calling for this vote with great repetition. His press secretary said it on October 3rd. David Plouffe, the senior White House advisor, said the same thing September 27th. David Axelrod, his top strategist, called for us to have this vote on September 13th. And the President himself, let me just count the number of times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times the President of the United States himself over the last few weeks has called on us to have this vote. As he put it, I want Congress to pass this jobs bill right away. Well, I hope that it will not pass because I don't think it's the right direction for the country to take to begin to deal with the joblessness issue. But I do think the President makes an important point that he is entitled to a vote. So if I were to be given the opportunity by my good friend, the Majority Leader, I would offer the President's jobs bill, which we think would be more accurately described as Stimulus 2, sort of a redux of the approach and the bill that we approved back in 2009, after which we've lost 1.7 million jobs. So therefore, I would ask consent to set aside the pending motion and amendments in order to offer the amendment which I have just described and hold in my hand at this moment.
Majority Leader.
Reserving the right to object. I'm not going to do a long dissertation on Stimulus 1, the jobs bill that we did to, in effect, do so much good for our country. I can't talk about the other 49 states, but I can talk about what the Recovery Act did for the state of Nevada. It basically saved the state of Nevada from going into bankruptcy. Hundreds of millions of dollars to help state government stop massive layoffs of teachers and create tens of thousands of jobs in areas like renewable energy. So that's enough on the American Recovery Act. I thought it was extremely important for Nevada. Other senators can come and talk about what the state, their own states, how it benefited. Mr. President, right away is a relative term. The President has been calling for a vote on his jobs bill, and rightfully so. Why did he start calling for a vote on his jobs bill? Because there was again one of the long obstructions that took place in the Senate and in the House on an issue that was fairly simple. What was that? Funding the Federal Emergency Management Agency. These devastating floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and fires had created a situation where FEMA was about to go broke. You would think we could move on quickly past that, but no, we couldn't. Because something we agreed on in late July, that we would fund the government for the rest of the year, was again brought to the forefront, and because the Republicans were threatening to close down the government again. So of course the President was calling for his jobs bill, recognizing that what was going on here in the Senate and in the House was a waste of time. That is, why were we spending time unnecessarily on funding one of the essentials of government, that is, taking care of people who have been devastated by these terrible storms and other calamities. Mr. President, we have moved very quickly after we got through that slog caused by the Republicans to get FEMA funded and to get the CR extended for 6 weeks. We're now on something that is long, long overdue, China currency. China has been manipulating their currency for a long time. The last 10 years, we've lost 2 million jobs because of this. If there were ever a jobs bill, it's this that we're doing on the floor right now. Now, I sponsored the President's bill. I'm the one that brought it to the floor. I have announced in a number of speeches I've given out here that I believe that we should move to this jobs bill. I'm sorry, I was handed something that threw my thought process off a little bit here. We need to move to this right away. There is no question about that. But to tack this on to the China currency manipulation legislation is nothing more than a political stunt. We all know that. Or if we don't, we should know. I'm telling everyone. I've said that I'll bring the American Jobs Act to the floor this work period. We have 2 more weeks left in this work period. So my suggestion would be this. Obviously, the Republican leader, my friend, the senator from Kentucky, wants to do something about the jobs bill. I'm glad that he does. He wants us to move this forward. So my suggestion would be to modify my friend's unanimous consent request and suggest that we have the permission, for lack of a better word, of the Republicans here in the Senate to immediately move. The motion to proceed would be unnecessary. We could move to that as soon as we finish. You have two choices. Either as soon as we finish the China currency legislation or we finish the trade legislation, which Senator McConnell and I have talked about finishing that next week. So I would move to modify his consent agreement, my friend, the Republican leader's consent agreement, that we move immediately to the legislation that I've introduced on behalf of the President, either after we finish the China currency legislation or after the trade bill, whatever my friend would rather do.
Mr. President.
The pending request is a request from the Republican leader.
Yep.
Which is, I've asked that it be modified.
Does the Republican leader so modify his request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I listened carefully to what my good friend, the majority leader, had to say, and he was talking about other matters debated at other times. The first stimulus bill, which we've, I think, probably have a basic disagreement on. I think it was almost total failure. He also talked about the debate we had with regard to the continuing resolution, which was finally worked out on a bipartisan basis. But those are things that occurred in the past. What I'm trying to do here today by suggesting that we vote on the President's jobs bill, which my good friend, the majority leader, has previously introduced, and I gather by way of introduction supports, that we honor the request of the President of the United States to vote on it now. He's been asking us repeatedly over the last few weeks to vote on it now. Now, if my friend the majority leader is saying he doesn't want to honor the President's request and vote on it now, but would like to consider voting on it later, that's something he and I can discuss as we decide how to move forward with Senate business. But I think the President of the United States, whose policies I generally speaking do not support, although I'm happy to support his initiatives on trade, be they ever so late, is entitled to know where the Senate stands on his proposal that he's been out talking about over and over and over again the last few weeks, suggesting that we are unwilling to vote on it. And what I'm saying is, we don't agree that it's the right policy, but we're more than willing to vote on it. And what I hear my friend the majority leader saying is that even though he supports it, he wants to vote on it some other time. Well, the President's been saying he doesn't want to vote on it some other time. He wants to vote on it now. And so I'd be happy to, if my friend is saying we're not going to vote on it now, I'd be happy to talk to him about reaching some kind of understanding to vote on it later. But my feeling here is that the least we can do for the President is give him a chance to have a vote on his proposal now, as he has requested on numerous occasions. So I will object to the modification, understanding full well that the majority leader and I, off the floor, will have further discussions about when we might move to the President's bill and give him the vote that he's been requesting.
Mr. President, further reserving my right to object. 14 million people in this country are out of work. What a charade we have going on here. We're in the midst of some of the most important legislation we've done this entire year, China currency manipulation. And we now have a proposal that is ridiculous on its face. That is, we vote with no debate on the President's jobs bill. This is senseless. It's unfair to bring this up in this form. And we're going to get to this, and we're going to do it either as soon as we finish this China currency or after we finish the trade bills, whatever I can work out with my Republican colleagues so that I can move to it. It takes 60 votes to get to this legislation, 60 votes to get to it. And so the American people, I'm sure, can see through this very clearly, that this is nothing more than a political stunt. It's clear that we need a full debate on this. We don't need a filibuster, and that time will come very, very soon. So I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, if I may just elaborate further. We've had a request from the President on multiple occasions to vote on what he calls his jobs bill and to vote on it now. I just, to count up again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times the President has asked us over the last few weeks to vote on what he calls his jobs bill now. I don't think the President is saying here he wants an extensive debate about it. I think he's saying he wants a vote on it. And I wanted to disabuse him of the notion that somehow we're unwilling to vote on his proposal. We are more than happy to vote on it. I understand why my friend, the Majority Leader, may have some reservations about going forward on this. I've read a number of critiques of this legislation by Democratic senators, one part of it or another. But look, even though there is bipartisan opposition to the President's jobs proposal, bipartisan opposition to it, I think he's entitled to a vote. And so I'm sorry that it appears that we will not be able to achieve this the President has repetitiously asked for over the last few weeks. I'd like to give him that vote, and we'll be talking to the Majority Leader about when we might have an opportunity to vote on his proposal, the President's proposal, which the Majority Leader introduced, which he has been requesting us to vote on.
Leader.
The President introduced his jobs bill. Immediately, the Republicans continue their obstruction on issues very simple, but maintain the floor. There are things going on here. You just can't automatically move to things. We know the Senate procedure. It takes 60 votes to get on a piece of legislation. The President was calling upon Congress, and especially the Republicans in Congress, to allow his jobs bill to move forward. As I indicated, we were hung up here on issues that had very little to do with the jobs bill. In fact, we shouldn't have been doing it. All the time, I repeat, hung up on FEMA funding, on the continuing resolution, which should have been approved quickly because we already agreed to that last July, but they reneged on that even and threatened shutting down government unless FEMA was paid for the way they wanted. And we were able ultimately to win that debate, but it took a long time. So when the President said he wants to move to his legislation right away, he was absolutely candid and forthright. Yes, he did want it. He wanted to clear the unimportant things off the floor, the stalling tax on the floor, and move to his bill. And that's what we're going to do. What I would be willing to do, Mr. President, if my friend would be agreeable, would the Republican leader agree to a vote on a motion to proceed to the jobs bill? We could do that. We could interrupt this legislation right here. We could interrupt the trade bills. We could vote on a motion to proceed to the jobs bill.
Was my friend propounding a consent agreement or simply asking a question?
Well, I can, if you're interested in the subject, I could put it in proper form, but you get the point. The bill's on the floor.
Yeah.
To get it on the floor, I need 60 votes. I would be happy if the Republican leader would agree to a vote on a motion to proceed to the jobs bill.
Mr. President, let me just say to my good friend, I'm prepared to vote on the President's proposal today. If the Majority Leader wants to vote on it some other day, we can talk about that, about how to move forward with it. But the President has been repeatedly asking us to take it up and vote on it now. And I'm prepared to do that. With regard to taking it up some other time and voting on it some other day, we'll be happy to talk about that off the floor, as we do frequently on every issue that we deal with.
Mr. President, I'm sure that in the immediate future, right away, the American people will see once again the Republicans are filibustering things they shouldn't be filibustering, this time a jobs bill.
I would just add in closing, Mr. President, I think my good friend's problem here, and I sympathize with him, is that there's bipartisan opposition to the President's proposal.
Mr. President, I heard my friends say that, and I didn't want to get into a long dissertation about bipartisan opposition. There's 53 of us. A majority of Democrats will support the President's jobs bill.
The majority leader just confirmed what I was saying, which is that there is bipartisan opposition to this, and we'll discuss at what point the majority leader is comfortable with going forward with this proposal. My only reason for offering it today was to respond to the President's request that we vote on it. And we're prepared to do that. If we can't do it today, we'll be happy to discuss, as we always do, the agenda of the Senate and when it would be appropriate to vote on it some other time.
Mr. President, I know that I only have in my head the math I learned from Mrs. Pickard at Searchlight Elementary School. But I do know that when you have 53, and I've told everyone here we'll get a majority of the Senate, majority of the Senate, not a majority of the Democrats, a majority of the Senate, that's really not very bipartisan opposition to this bill.
Mr. President, I can only quote my good friend, the Majority Leader, who repeatedly has said, most recently in early '07, that in the Senate it's always been the case you need 60 votes. This is my good friend, the Majority Leader, when he was the leader of the majority in March of '07, and he said it repeatedly, both when he was in the minority, as leader of the minority or leader of the majority, that it requires 60 votes, certainly on things that are controversial. So it's not at all unusual that the President's proposal of this consequence, that we raise taxes, that we spend $500 billion on a second stimulus bill, would have to achieve 60 votes. That's the way virtually all business is done in the Senate, certainly not extraordinary or unusual.
The American people will see very soon that a majority of the United States Senate supports the President's jobs bill. Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Quorum call be initiated.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to be allowed to speak for 10 minutes, and following my remarks that Senator Barrasso be allowed to speak.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to speak for a few minutes today about an amendment that I introduced that, in my view, gets to the heart of some of the more troubling Chinese trade policies that are threatening the economic security and the long-term competitiveness of our country. It's well known that many foreign companies, many American companies operating in China are required to transfer their intellectual property and proprietary technology to China as a prerequisite for doing business in that country. And I will repeat that. They are required to transfer this technology. And despite assurances from Chinese leadership earlier this year that this was no longer, quote, official Chinese policy, China does continue to be aggressive and overt in its pursuit of foreign intellectual property as it seeks to develop its own, what it calls indigenous innovation. Companies like General Electric, Westinghouse, among many others, have been required to transfer proprietary technology to Chinese counterparts in order to do business there. Mr. President, if a private company has developed technology on its own and it makes a business decision to transfer that technology to a joint venture partner in a place like China, unless there are national security issues, we are obligated to respect the free marketplace. They may be seeking short-term profits at the expense of long-term competitiveness, but that is a business decision. But it's a different case when the American taxpayer has financed the development of these technologies through federal funding assistance, and I do not believe it's appropriate to allow those technologies simply to be given away to other countries. Every American owns a piece of intellectual property that has been financed through taxpayer assistance. Federal dollars that go toward R&D funding, loan guarantees, public-private partnerships in order to help develop the next generation of technologies here are supposed to be making American businesses competitive and generate American jobs, not to help develop other industries such as those in China. And my amendment would prohibit that practice. Last year, the United States Chamber of Commerce issued a report entitled China's Drive for Indigenous Innovation. The Chamber noted that China's master plan for the development of science and technology is, quote, considered by many international technology companies to be a blueprint for technology theft on a scale the world has never seen before, end quote. The report went on to state that China's, quote, persistent intellectual property theft is compounded by the indigenous innovation industrial policies which compel technology transfers in order to have access to Chinese markets, end quote. The New York Times recently reported that Ford Motor Company is looking to share proprietary technologies for electrical vehicles in exchange for selling cars in China. The electric vehicle sector has been developed through federal R&D funding, loan guarantees, and public-private partnerships, costs borne by American taxpayers. In 2009, for instance, Ford Motor Company received a $5.9 billion loan guarantee from the Department of Energy to advance its vehicle technology manufacturing program. We see these types of transfers in other industries as well. The Washington Post reported last month that General Electric has transferred valuable avionics technology to state-owned Aviation Industry Corporation of China. Our government has long supported the aviation industry through procurement initiatives and federal research projects. The fruits of American taxpayer support may now be incorporated into Chinese commercial airliners in line with China's desire to develop an internationally competitive aircraft industry that could rival American-based Boeing. We see similar examples of technology transfer in the nuclear energy sector. According to the Financial Times, Westinghouse Electric has transferred more than 75,000 documents to Chinese counterparts as the initial phase of a technology transfer program in exchange for a share of China's growing nuclear market. These documents relate to the construction of 4 third-generation AP1000 reactors that Westinghouse is building in China. American taxpayers supported the development of the AP1000, as well as its predecessor, the AP600, through decades of nuclear energy research and development at the Department of Energy. In other words, our taxpayers provided years of government support for the design and licensing of this reactor. In January 2010, in a letter to Obama administration officials, the heads of 19 American business and industry associations wrote, quote, of systemic efforts by China to develop policies that build their domestic enterprises at the expense of U.S. firms and intellectual property. Signatories to that letter included the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I would like to add that letter to the record at this point with unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'm introducing an amendment today, a very simple amendment. It's intended to protect American innovation and American jobs, and it's intended to make America more competitive and to create jobs here at home. In cases where technologies are developed with the support of the American taxpayer, my legislation prohibits companies from transferring the technology to countries that by law, practice, or policy require proprietary technology transfers as a matter of doing business. It says a country which by law, practice, or policy is required to transfer proprietary technology or intellectual property as a condition of doing business in that country will not be the recipient of any of these technologies that were developed with the assistance of the American taxpayer. Quite simply, if taxpayers supported the development of the technology, they own a piece of it, and it can't just be given away. The transfer of publicly supported proprietary technologies by American firms to China and potentially other countries clearly and unequivocally places the competitive advantage of the American economy at risk. Our trade laws are designed in order to protect national security, but our economic security is also an element of our national security. Intellectual property in the civilian sector should also be protected. My amendment seeks to do that. Mr. President, I believe this is an issue that every senator can support. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today, as I have repeatedly since the health care bill was signed into law, to offer a doctor's second opinion about issues related to that health care law. And, Mr. President, a group of House and Senate Republican lawmakers, including Senator Thune of South Dakota, released a startling new report about the President's health care law. The report is entitled Class's Untold Story: Taxpayers, Employers, and States on the Hook for Flawed Entitlement Program. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to have this included as part of the record. Thank you, Mr. President. Many may remember that President Obama's health care law established a brand new federal long-term care entitlement program. It is called the CLASS program, a Community Living Assistance Services and Supports. Well, this CLASS program pays a stipend to individuals enrolled when they're unable to perform daily living activities, dressing, bathing, eating. And to qualify for the benefits, an individual would have to pay a monthly premium for 5 years, before the federal government starts to pay out any of the benefits. The health care law mandates that the CLASS program collects individual premiums for those 5 years before the program actually even starts to pay out benefits. Well, sounds pretty good, but not so fast. When it comes to the health care law, the American people have come to realize that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. The CLASS program was supposed to start January 1st of 2011, so about 10 months ago. But the Obama administration's officials decided to delay the program because they know it doesn't work. It's now known that the CLASS program was an intentionally designed budget gimmick. That's correct, an intentionally designed budget gimmick. During Senate floor debate of the President's health care bill, I, along with many other members on this side of the aisle, warned repeatedly that the CLASS program is a financial disaster waiting to happen. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the CLASS program would reduce the deficit by $70 billion over a 10-year period. Well, these savings are mythical, and they come from the premium dollars that CLASS collects those first 5 years before it pays out a single penny. during those first 5 years, the program is not required to pay out any benefits to any individuals. Over its first 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office says that this class program will collect $83 billion in premiums and only pay out $13 billion in benefits. But instead of holding on to the $70 billion in excess premiums collected to pay for future expenses that we know are coming, well, members of the Senate, members on the other side of the aisle, used those same funds to pay for the President Obama's health care law. And to add insult to injury, Washington Democrats then tried to claim that the $70 billion could also be used to pay down on the deficit. Well, the American people immediately saw that this claim was irresponsible. Even the Senate Budget Committee chairman, Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota, admitted that the class program was, quote, a Ponzi scheme of the first order, something he said Bernie Madoff would be proud of. Yet the President and Washington Democrats pushed to include this class program in the health care law. This new report provides undeniable evidence that administration officials knew the class program's design and payment structure were fiscally unsustainable. The Obama administration knew it, and yet they repeatedly ignored the explicit and persistent warnings. You may ask yourself, why is that? Well, the only logical explanation is that the administration officials chose to hide the class program's true cost from congressional lawmakers and the American people, all to advance President Obama's ideological health care agenda. This push to advance an agenda rather than reasonable patient-centered health care reforms served only to create yet another unsustainable entitlement program, an entitlement program that this country simply cannot afford. The Obama administration's own chief actuary, a man named Richard Foster, he repeatedly tried to tell the administration officials that the class program was not fiscally sound. Internal emails from Mr. Foster first warned administration officials in May of 2009, well before the health care law was enacted. According to that report, this is what Mr. Foster's email says. He says, the program is intended to be actuarial sound, but at first glance, this goal may be impossible. He said due to the limited scope of the insurance coverage, the voluntary class plan would probably not attract many participants other than individuals who already meet the criteria to qualify as beneficiaries. He went on to say while the 5-year vesting period would allow the fund to accumulate a modest level of assets, all such assets should be used just to meet benefit payments due in the first few months of the 6th year. And then a key sentence. The resulting substantial premium increases required to prevent fund exhaustion would likely reduce the number of participants, and a classic assessment spiral, or, he says, insurance death spiral would ensue. Well, what does this mean in plain English? It means that the class premiums will be too expensive to persuade young, healthy people to participate. It means that the class plan's long-term care payout is very enticing to people who know they're going to need the care. Healthy people don't participate. Sicker people do participate. Individuals in the health care system call the phenomenon adverse selection. When adverse selection occurs, then the American taxpayer is at very serious risk of being forced to bail out the program when it fails. The report goes on to show that Mr. Foster repeated his concerns during the summer of 2009. He writes to another administration official. He says, I'm sorry to report that I remain very doubtful that this proposal is sustainable at the specified premium and benefit amounts. But he says, 36 years of actuarial experience lead me to believe, he said, that this program would collapse in short order and require significant federal subsidies to continue. Well, let me remind everyone that the chief actuary is a nonpartisan, high-ranking official at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Chief Actuary's estimates are critical to understand the health care law's true fiscal impact and long-term viability. Mr. Foster certainly doesn't have an axe to grind. He simply offered his analysis based on the data, and the Obama administration ignored it. Not only did Obama administration officials ignore Mr. Foster, they stopped requesting his input. But Mr. Foster wasn't alone. In the fall of 2009, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation also raised the red flag. According to the report, one employee wrote in an email on October 22nd, quote, "Seems like a recipe for disaster to me." He said, "I can't imagine that class would not have high levels of adverse selection given the significantly higher premiums compared to similar policies in the private market." Mr. President, just a week after Senator Thune released this stunning new report on the floor of the Senate, media outlets indicated that the Department of Health and Human Services has closed its class program. Mr. Bob Yee, the class chief actuary, announced the closure in an email. He went on to say that he would leave his position at the class office actuary effective immediately. News reports indicated that the class office's employees have either been reassigned or asked to leave. Mysteriously, however, the Department of Health and Human Services issued a statement denying that the office was officially closing. In fact, the statement failed to say if and when the class program would even start. The Obama administration has had 18 months to figure out how to implement this class program. Recent developments show that they're not even close to resolving questions about the program's solvency. The American people deserve more. The American people deserve the truth. The evidence is indisputable. Administration officials at the Department of Health and Human Services knew that the class program was unsustainable. And they knew it before President Obama signed the health care bill into law. They knew it. Yet this Senate and the House of Representatives and the administration failed in their duty to be honest with the American people and to tell them the truth. Were administration officials deliberately hiding class's true cost for political gain? Well, this is certainly not the first time during the last several weeks that we have seen troubling reports exposing the administration's tendency to ignore financial warnings. They ignore the warnings so that they can advance politically important projects to them, projects that turn into expensive failures with the American taxpayers being stuck with the bill. I see this report, this incredible study, this report as yet one more piece of evidence that the President's health care law must be repealed. It must be repealed and replaced with reasonable, common sense, and financially sound alternatives. Patient-centered reforms that allow individuals to get the care they need from the doctor that they want at a price they can afford. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.